In late June, more than a dozen U.S. trading partners were rushing to cut deals before President Trump's July 9th deadline to avoid tariffs jumping into the 10 to 50% range. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned bluntly that if any country proved recalcitrant, Washington would snap back to the higher tariff rates it announced in April. In other words, the U.S. set a do-or-die date: make concessions or suffer steep 25% car tariffs and 50% steel or aluminum tariffs. The numbers speak for themselves. Countries faced a stark choice of kneecapping their exports or cutting a deal fast. EU's unusual offer: 10% tariff for trade concessions. According to Reuters and Bloomberg, Brussels quietly floated a very unusual response: accept a flat 10% U.S. tariff on many European exports in exchange for other concessions. In practice, this means EU exporters to the U.S. from cars and wine to chemicals and luxury goods would each pay a 10% levy at the border. In return, EU negotiators want the U.S. to cut its own tariffs on the most sensitive sectors. Specifically, the EU is demanding lower U.S. duties on European pharmaceuticals, wine and spirits, semiconductors, and Airbus jets. Brussels is also pushing for carve-outs so that America has 25% auto tariff and 50% steel or aluminum. Tariff would not bite so hard on Europe as producers. Put another way, Europe would rather take a small uniform tax than risk an unpredictable trade war. In short, the EU proposal trades a blanket 10% hit on itself for a promise that the US will ease up on the biggest pain points. From the EU's perspective, this may have seemed the least bad option. If the alternative was no deal at all, Europe could end up with full 25 to 50% levies anyway. By offering a universal tariff, Brussels buys a seat at the table and trade-off power. It can argue, okay, we take 10%, but you must remove special levies on things vital to our economy. Cynics call this appeasement, but officials likely weighed job losses in key industries against the risk of total tariff chaos. But here EU leaders seem convinced it serves Europe's broader interest and keeps a deal alive. Either way, to the public it looks odd, handing your own exporters a tax just to keep the peace. Critics note the logic is backwards. A country usually protects its exporters, not voluntarily taxes them. On the eve of July 1st, Ottawa scrapped its new 3% digital services tax on U.S. tech firms, effective immediately. Canada's retreat. Digital tax dropped. Talks resume. The move came minutes before the tax was due and came directly after a Trump ultimatum. He had announced he was terminating all discussions on trade with Canada because of the levy. Cave to President Trump and the United States of America would have been a deal breaker for any trade deal with America. Canada's leaders took an even more dramatic step. This was the exact tax President Trump had publicly railed against. The rationale was blunt. Ottawa judged that the harm from a U.S. trade freeze new tariffs. Sanctions far exceeded any benefit from the digital tax. Once the tax was dropped, talks miraculously revived. White House officials wasted no time celebrating. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt crowed that Prime Minister Carney. U.S. Commerce Secretary Lloyd Lutnick posted on social media, "Thank you, Canada, for removing your digital services tax," which, in plain terms, Canada voluntarily tore up a homegrown tax to keep negotiations moving. Canada's leaders concluded it was better to swallow this concession than let relations plunge into chaos, as Trump himself threatened. To many onlookers, however, it looked like a humiliating climb-down. Japan, India, South Korea, and others have faced their own showdowns. Some critics jokingly suggested Ottawa should have retaliated with its own tax on oil or electricity exports, but in practice Canada had little leverage. Prime Minister Kishida insisted he was defending Japan's national interest even as President Trump publicly chided Tokyo on Twitter. Auto parts and farm tariffs. New Delhi dug in on protecting its dairy and nut farmers unless the U.S. eased its tariffs on Indian steel and auto parts. complaining Japan won't take U.S. rice despite a massive rice shortage and hinted at barring Japanese cars if his demands weren't met. The American market is simply too big, resisting risked heavy pain for Canada's economy. So Canada did what it thought was necessary: dispense with the tech tax and hope for a more comprehensive deal that would protect Canadian interests in the long run. Allies on the line, Japan, India, and beyond the US wasn't only pressuring Europe and Canada. Japan was scrambling to escape a 25% US tariff on its automobiles. Only a handful like Britain had already struck deals to dodge the worst tariffs on cars. India's negotiations hit a snag over U.S. complaints on steel. South Korea, which already has a zero-tariff pact, still felt pressure. Washington shifted the debate to currency exchange and who should pay for U.S. troops on Korean soil. Even Thailand got into the act, promising to cut its own tariffs and buy more U.S. goods to avoid steep penalties on Thai exports. In each case, trading partners hit the familiar decision fork: acquiesce to Trump or watch key exports be taxed off a cliff. Many chose prudence over principle, fearing that refusal would instantly slam their businesses with those punitive U.S. levies. For the rest, the spectacle is similar: scrambling to find terms that avert disaster. Analysis: self-interest or appeasement. So what should rational, self-interested governments do in this situation? In theory, they'd protect their own industries. Europe could retaliate with its own tariffs on U.S. products, or Canada could tax American imports, making the U.S. pay a price. That tit-for-tat approach might make economic sense in the long run, but in practice every country fears the next move from Washington. A tiny reprisal might trigger a much larger U.S. response. Since America is so big, an escalation could quickly hurt far more jobs at home. Also, many countries depend on American security or economic goodwill. NATO allies like the EU and Canada rely on the US for defense, so politicians there balance that strategic tie against their trade interests. Even business groups warn their own governments that sparring with Trump might jeopardize broader deals and cause market panic. Critics howl that this looks less like defending the national interest and more like appeasement. After all, countries are allowing painful concessions just to keep the US at the table. The logic many Americans seem to demand, mutually beneficial trade and diversified supply chains, has taken a back seat. Instead, we have nervous capitulation. For example, the EU's offer to tax its own exports at 10% is counterintuitive, if the goal is to help Europe. Similarly, Canada repealing a homegrown tech tax is the exact opposite of stand up to the bully for its own tech industry. Observers note that by cutting deals early, allies may only be emboldening tougher demands next time. One commentator even likened this to a classic appeasement trap: given now, and the bully hits even harder later. Whether these moves are prudent or pathetic depends on whom you ask. The leaders involved clearly did a cost-benefit calculation, accept modest pain to avoid catastrophic losses. But from a neutral standpoint, it looks like governments are sacrificing some autonomy to preserve trade flow. The populace, however, has not been shy about calling out what they see as irrational behavior. Terms like caving, bowing, or worse have trended online. The underlying question remains: why did allies not dig in harder? The answer seems to be fear of blowback, mixed with urgent deadlines and political pressures at home. In effect, they've chosen a short-term fix over a prolonged fight, even if it means paying a price: higher taxes on exports or fewer wins in negotiation. Global dominoes, beyond Trump and his tariffs. This story has global implications well beyond US-EU or US-Canada ties. For one, it shifts perceptions of China and other powers. With Western allies acceding, China's own tough stance, like holding rare earth minerals hostage, and may look more credible. By late June, Reuters reported Washington finally negotiated with Beijing to resume some rare earth exports after China had frozen them earlier this spring. Meanwhile, countries once targeted by Trump might start thinking twice before confronting America on other issues. Will Mexico or Japan, for instance, demand more from the U.S. now, or quietly comply next time? On the other hand, some see a glimmer of long-term strategy. Repeated tariff threats have raised awareness of the fragility of global supply chains. Analysts echoing comments from U.S. officials argue that even allies must eventually factor in hidden costs. Relying on one market, one currency, or one route is risky. In theory, Canada and Europe could use this moment to diversify their trade and invest in self-reliance. In reality, building new supply lines or domestic industries takes years, and as long as Americans keep pushing deals, governments face immense pressure to take what they can now. In the end, the week's news is a mixed bag. On paper, Washington scored a few apparent concessions: a suspended tax in Canada, a proposed universal levy from Europe, but what they cost those allies remains unclear. The world has watched friends of the U.S. make unusually one-sided concessions to meet Trump's demands. Whether that stabilizes trade or merely sets up more fights remains to be seen. The fear is that appeasement always has a sequel. Once the pressure eases, the next set of demands will be tougher. For now, though, many governments have chosen to swallow this bitter pill. What's certain is that U.S. allies and rivals alike will remember how this played out. They will ask, did Europe and Canada really protect their economies, or did they just limp along to avoid Trump's wrath? Only time will tell which strategy turns out wiser. For the public watching, the verdict is already clear. These moves look like capitulation on the global stage, a bitter but possibly necessary medicine for now. Sources: recent news reports on US-EU and US-Canada trade negotiations by Reuters and Bloomberg cited above show the specifics of the tariff proposals and concessions. These reports provide the factual basis for the above analysis. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We bring you the latest and most interesting global hotspot analysis every day, making complex international politics easy to understand. See you next time.